The title is the topic. Today I'm going to review the feminist frequency video Women as Background Decoration Part 1. The first thing I want to do is mention Anita's resources. The first video I did on her work, Questioning Research, talks a bit about her studies. To summarize what that video was about, I demonstrate Anita's resources do not prove these games to have long-term negative side effects. So any argument she uses in this video about how these games affect people are not necessarily proven. As for how many games she references, in Part 1 of Women as Background Decoration, she claims 52 games. As I demonstrated in Hiding Laziness Part 3, Anita has issues with giving precise numbers because she eventually had 3 sets of numbers for how many games she referenced in the Damsel in Distress series.
Studied extensively.
So I decided to count every game on the list and the list on her website to make sure it is 52 games. I'll also note she doesn't have a documented list of other games with this trope like she does with the Damsel in Distress games, because like I've said, as she makes more videos, her research just gets lazier.
Studied extensively.
On Women as Background Decoration Part 2, she lists 29 games. I checked this on her website as well to confirm the numbers. That is a total of 81 games between Part 1 and 2. She has games on here like Super Mario Galaxy 2 and Popo and Yo. I don't think these are about the trope itself, however I'll just leave them on here anyways. When excluding duplicates because she referenced 14 games in both episodes, you end up with a total of 67. I will check this against my numbers for every game ever made in my Damsel in Distress Part 1 review, 27,082. We end up with 0.24%. That is less than 0.25% of every game ever made according to my numbers, and my numbers are low when you look at other lists that show how many games exist. Remember what she said about these tropes?
Welcome to our multi-part video series exploring the roles and representations of women in video games. This project will examine the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
She also said this in her Kickstarter video.
And the most common trope in video games, women as background decoration, with well-researched, in-depth analysis. As you might imagine, this project requires an enormous amount of research, because I'm not just looking at a handful of games or just the worst offenders, but at hundreds of games and hundreds of different characters across all genres. This is an incredibly ambitious project because of the scope and scale of the research and production involved.
I will also point out most of these are racing games and mature titles. She demonstrates this trope to only be prevalent in the racing game genre and mature titles. Having said that, let's get on with the review.
In November 1971, the year before Atari's Pong became a sensation, an oddly shaped fiberglass video cabinet appeared in pinball arcades in the United States. That game was called Computer Space and holds the distinction of being the very first commercially sold video game ever made. The coin-operated machine allowed players to fly a crude pixelated rocket ship while shooting down pixelated flying saucers. Promotional materials for the game, however, featured a woman standing passively next to the enclosure wearing a see-through nightie with her underwear visible underneath.
I would agree this probably wasn't necessary for advertisement of this game. However, according to Wikipedia, Computer Space was the first widely available video and arcade game, although it was not a success. It fared well on college campuses, but it was not very popular in bars and other venues. If a bar is the kind of place they are promoting this game, I'm not exactly surprised they advertised it this way.
This advertising strategy of using women and representations of women as decorative elements to try and sell games to boys and men soon became the norm for the burgeoning industry. In ad after ad throughout the 80s and 90s, we see women placed on display alongside arcade games, conflating the two and presenting them both as toys to be played with.
Let's go back to your Ms. Male character video and see what you had to say about Pac-Man, which was released in the 80s.
Incidentally, Toru Iwatani, the creator of Pac-Man, has stated in numerous interviews that the game was designed to appeal to women.
So while some of the promotional material of games back then was aimed at young men, developers were also designing games that were geared to draw more women into gaming.
Studied extensively. In an effort to continue appealing to female gamers, Crazy Otto was briefly changed to Pac-Woman, then to Miss Pac-Man, before finally becoming Ms. Pac-Man.
I'm a Pac-Man freak.
Game developers as far back as the early 80s also wanted more women playing games.
In these promotional materials, advertisers are not just selling a product, they're also selling gaming as a lifestyle, in which women predominantly exist as passive objects of heterosexual male desire. The game was designed to appeal to women. These ads contributed to an emergent culture in which women were thought of as ornamental and peripheral to a male gaming experience. In an effort to continue appealing to female gamers, and since women were largely already seen as incidental eye candy, it's not surprising that when female characters started being introduced to more game worlds, before finally becoming Ms. Pac-Man, the roles tended to follow similar patterns.
I'm a Pac-Man freak.
I'm not trying to be a smartass, I'm trying to make a point. Some game developers also want more girls playing games. Female characters were being introduced as far back as the early 80s that were not necessarily sexualized. And several of the games Anita shows are racing games and more mature titles. Anita also talked about how as more women were portrayed in games, they were reflective of the way it was advertised. Both the advertisements and portrayals of women in game are in large part because
it's a reflection of our society.
These games reflect the society we live in. This type of advertisement can also be found in various other forms of media. It isn't just video games. And even at that, this does not exist in every video game or in all forms of video game advertisement. This issue isn't nearly as bad as Anita makes it sound when you look at all the factors.
The practice of using hypersexualized women as ornamental objects has been especially brazen in the racing game genre.
The racing game genre, as opposed to other genres where this issue is not as prevalent.
From a systemic, big-picture perspective. Notice how the camera moves, how it focuses on and zooms in on specific body parts to highlight the aspects of women meant to be the most important.
Now I'm going to be a smartass. Notice how the camera moves, how it focuses on and zooms in on specific body parts to highlight the aspects of men meant to be the most important. That was from 1975, which predates most of the video games Anita is talking about.
Studied extensively.
I know what Anita is trying to get at with her point, but I'm just saying under certain circumstances, men can receive similar treatment.
I define the women as background decoration trope in video games as the subset of largely insignificant, non-playable female characters whose sexuality or victimhood is exploited as a way to infuse edgy, gritty, or racy flavoring into game worlds. These sexually objectified female bodies are designed to function as environmental texture, while titillating presumed straight male players.
Notice how she said I define?
I define the women as background decoration trope in video games.
That means she can identify it, name it, describe it, and define whether it is right or wrong to use this trope. Let's go back to the description of the trope. This is a subset of largely insignificant non-playable female characters. A subset of characters predominantly found in mature titles and the racing game genre.
The practice of using hypersexualized women as ornamental objects has been especially brazen in the racing game genre, from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
Mature titles and racing games are a part of the industry, and this is a subset of NPCs that exists in some of those games.
Sometimes they're created to be glorified furniture, but they are frequently programmed as minimally interactive sex objects to be used and abused.
So we have some description of what the trope is, but as I've pointed out, this is not a big picture issue, and there are no proven long-term negative effects in the real world from these games.
In gaming lingo, the secondary characters populating the virtual environments are referred to as NPCs, short for non-player characters or non-playable characters. These are figures not directly controlled by the player, and whose behaviors and dialogue are governed by automated scripts within the game's code. NPCs can occupy a wide variety of supportive, neutral, or non-combatant roles, all with varying degrees of importance or levels of engagement with the protagonist. They can be pedestrians, shopkeepers, quest givers, party members, or sidekicks.
So as we learn, NPCs come in a large variety of roles.
However, for the purposes of this trope, we're only concerned with one very particular type of non-essential female NPC. Those specifically designed as a decorative virtual sex class who exist to service straight male desire. I classify this subset of characters as non-playable sex objects.
A subset of NPCs and a part of the gaming industry where these games have ratings.
Non-playable sex objects can usually be found on the sidelines of role-playing or open-world style games, populating the many virtual strip clubs, red light districts, or brothel locations that have become almost obligatory in many so-called mature titles.
Why do you think they would have non-playable sex objects in things like strip clubs, red light districts, or brothels in games?
Because it's a reflection of our society.
And she specified mature titles.
That have become almost obligatory in many so-called mature titles.
This is what Anita said about non-player characters earlier.
These are figures not directly controlled by the player, and whose behaviors and dialogue are governed by automated scripts within the game's code.
All these sexualized characters are automated, just as many other types of NPCs are. For instance, if you see a blacksmith, he'll probably be working beside an anvil and forge. If you see a stripper, she'll probably be dancing. And the vast majority of NPCs have little to no individual personality or identity. Lots of NPCs can just be pedestrians walking down the street.
Such characters are programmed with crude, looping sexualized behaviors or dialogue as a way of adding an extra layer of seedy flavoring to game universes. Because it's a reflection of our society. Unlike other NPCs that exist for purposes outside of their sexuality, non-playable sex objects have little to no individual personality or identity to speak of.
Outside of NPCs that serve a specific function in the game for storytelling elements, there is no need to give them personality or identities, whether they be a stripper in a club or a pedestrian on the street. Sometimes these NPCs are just there to add a degree of realism.
And almost never get to be anything other than set dressing or props in someone else's narrative. NPCs can occupy a wide variety of supportive, neutral, or non-combatant roles, all with varying degrees of importance or levels of engagement with the protagonist.
Sounds to me like being a set dressing or prop fits within the confines of the purpose of an NPC. These specific NPCs serve their specific purpose.
This is the essence of what sexual objectification means. And since that concept is at the heart of the women as background decoration trope, let's take a moment to define it. As the term implies, sexual objectification is the practice of treating or representing a human being as a thing or a mere instrument to be used for another's sexual purposes. Sexually objectified women are valued primarily for their bodies or body parts, which are presented as existing for the pleasure and gratification of others.
I could come up with equally compelling descriptions for several other types of NPCs in games. It is also not inherently wrong to portray women like this, since they are a subset of NPCs in some games with no long-term negative side effects. And a lot of these games try to reflect the world to a certain extent.
Because it's a reflection of our society.
If you want the tropes to change, you need to fix the issues in the real world. As long as media wants to keep reflecting society, you'll never completely get rid of these portrayals if it exists in the real world. The only other option would be to maybe restrict the freedom of game developers with laws or regulations prohibiting this style of game design.
In some games, sexual objectification is fused with the exotification of impoverished women of color. In Far Cry 3 and Max Payne 3, for example, straight white protagonists explore shanty towns located in the global south, populated by prostituted women.
Notice how she said in some games?
In some games, from a systemic, big-picture perspective.
She also said it is fused with exotification of impoverished women of color, then straight white male protagonist. If you go to a section of a foreign town described the way Anita describes it, you will probably see this in the real world. This comes across as making it a race issue to make it sound even worse than what it is.
The sexually subservient Asian prostitute trope also permeates urban environments in games like Binary Domain and Deus Ex Human Revolution. These women speak in broken English, and their minimal dialogue is designed to invoke shades of sex tourism style exploitation.
I'm assuming if I found an Asian prostitute in the real world whose native language is not English that is trying to sell sex to an English-speaking male, her English will probably be broken. This is also limited in its portrayal to what Anita said.
The sexually subservient Asian prostitute trope.
So even if they got rid of this portrayal, if they were still prostitutes, Anita would still take issue with it. I'm not necessarily justifying why it's in the game, I'm just explaining why it's there to begin with.
Scenarios like these are part of a long racist tradition of representing women of color as mysterious and hypersexual creatures who exist as an exotic spice to be consumed by the white or Western man.
So let's break that last section down.
Scenarios like these are part of a long racist tradition of representing women of color as mysterious and hypersexual creatures.
They only represent women like that under a specific context that you already clarified.
The sexually subservient Asian prostitute trope.
So not all women of color are portrayed like this. You make it sound like some game developers are racist the moment they try to portray any sense of realism in their games.
Who exist as an exotic spice to be consumed by the white or Western man.
The white or Western man. You are now interjecting race into your trope to make it a racist issue, not just a sexist one. This is what you do in every single video you make on these tropes. You keep adding things to them to shame developers and make the tropes seem worse than if you look at them as separate issues.
By the way, games set in the United States are not exempt from this kind of racist exotification.
So it exists in the global South and the United States.
Straight white protagonists explore shanty towns located in the global South. Games set in the United States are not exempt from this kind of racist exotification.
Basically, anywhere a mature game takes place in a real-world setting, the player can potentially encounter something that exists in the real world.
These scenarios place men in the driver's seat, so to speak, and sell us the notion that men are always sexual subjects, while women are largely sexual objects. Incidentally, this trope also exists in games that may allow players to pick a female avatar. But the presence of a woman inhabiting the role of protagonist, even if well developed, doesn't do anything to negate the fact that non-playable sex objects are still specifically coded to pander to a presumed heterosexual male ego.
Want to know why non-playable sex objects are like that in mature titles?
These are figures not directly controlled by the player, and whose behaviors and dialogue are governed by automated scripts within the game's code.
If you change NPCs in a game because the player decided to play a female, you usually have to redesign, rescript, and add new dialogue to an NPC that is largely unimportant to the gameplay or the story. I'm not sure what the answers are to this specific problem, but it's a little more complicated than you lead your audience to believe.
Sexual objectification is, of course, ubiquitous in mass media of all forms.
Good. Which is what I said earlier when you were talking about how these games can be marketed. It's like I've been saying, I don't think you'll solve this issue which you acknowledge exists outside of video games by changing video games.
But since video games are an interactive medium, players are allowed to move beyond the traditional role of voyeur or spectator. Because of its essential interactive nature, gaming occupies a unique and potentially more detrimental position vis-a-vis the portrayal and treatment of female characters. A viewer of non-interactive media is restricted to gazing at what the media makers want them to see. Similar to what we might see in video game cutscenes, the audience is only afforded one fixed perspective. But since we're talking about interactive gameplay within a three-dimensional environment, we need to consider the fact that players are encouraged to participate directly in the objectification of women through control of the player character, and by extension control of the game camera. In other words, games move the viewer from the position of spectator to that of the participant in the media experience.
Let's break that section down a little bit.
But since video games are an interactive medium,
it does not matter if it's an interactive medium. You have to prove it is harmful. You can't just imply it, which is exactly what you do.
Gaming occupies a unique and potentially more detrimental position.
You say potentially, you do not prove it to be true.
We need to consider the fact that players are encouraged to participate directly in the objectification of women.
You say we need to consider it? Anita says potentially, and we should consider it. She is trying to convince people to worry about these issues before she's demonstrated it to be an issue in need of changing.
Studied extensively.
They may be participants, but it's still a two-dimensional screen. Even in a 3D world, you are still looking at a screen, just as with a movie. Until most of these games place you in a virtual world via something like Oculus Rift, and that becomes a mainstream thing, I don't think interacting with a game is that much more harmful than watching a movie.
On a very basic level, we can think of non-interactive media as engaging audiences in forms of passive looking, while video games provide players the chance to partake in forms of active looking or active observing.
You just spent the last section asking that we consider this because it potentially has a negative effect, but actively objectifying women in these games does not have any long-term negative effects from what I've seen.
The opening moments in The Darkness 2, for instance, teaches players how to operate the game's control scheme by instructing you to actively objectify women in the environment. Level designers also have a suspicious tendency to build stages in which players are required to walk through brothels, strip clubs, or women's dressing rooms in order to advance the story. In the case of The Saboteur, the protagonist's home base is located inside a burlesque club, which conveniently enough, you can only enter via the women's changing area. These active viewing mechanics encourage players to collaborate with developers in sexual objectification by enabling gamers to scope out and spy on non-playable sex objects.
If they want to reflect a degree of realism in these games, you can't just make this stuff off limits. Could they use these game design choices less often? I suppose. However, I would not expect game developers to stop using these themes, especially considering these are mature titles. Another thing I'll add is several people who have a more in-depth knowledge of these games than I do reviewed your videos and pointed out how you misrepresent gameplay mechanics and cherry-pick clips to frame your arguments. Also, what I've noticed is your videos are full of implications of how these games might negatively affect people, but you never demonstrate that to be a fact.
Since we're discussing the intersection of objectification and interaction, we also need to consider some more direct aspects of objectification that are not as applicable in traditional mass media.
They aren't as applicable here as you are implying because you never proved it to be a problem the way you frame it.
Building off of philosopher Martha Nussbaum's work on objectification theory, I've identified a number of fundamental aspects of objectification, including instrumentality, commodification, interchangeability, violability, and disposability, all of which are commonly embedded into the gameplay mechanics and programmed behaviors of NPCs in modern immersive titles.
NPCs. I assume she means background decoration in specific since this is about the objectification of women. So let's see where this goes.
Since instrumentality is a core component of objectification, let's begin there. In the realm of interactive media, I use the term instrumentality to refer to the practice of using virtual women as tools or props for the player's own purposes.
Her description of instrumentality could be applied to several types of NPCs if you change the words.
NPCs can occupy a wide variety of supportive, neutral, or non-combatant roles. In the realm of interactive media, I use the term instrumentality to refer to the practice of using pedestrians, shopkeepers, quest givers, party members, or sidekicks as tools or props for the player's own purposes.
For the next section, I want to reference something Anita said in Damsel in Distress Part 2.
Given the reality of that larger cultural context, it should go without saying that it's dangerously irresponsible to be creating games in which players are encouraged and even required to perform violence against women in order to save them. Even though most of the games that we're talking about don't explicitly condone violence against women, nevertheless they trivialize and exploit female suffering as a way to ratchet up the emotional or sexual stakes for the player.
I already addressed that argument in my review of that video, but then Anita went on to say this.
Despite these troubling implications, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy. Most probably just haven't given much thought to the underlying messages their games are sending, and in many cases, developers have backed themselves into a corner with their own game mechanics.
I would debate whether they back themselves into a corner with their gameplay mechanics, as these tropes aren't necessarily harmful, but I want to focus on this line here.
Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy.
The point I'm making is these game developers aren't nearly as bad as Anita makes them sound, and that is coming from Anita Sarkeesian herself.
Studied extensively. Courtesans in the Assassin's Creed series, for instance, are available to be rented and used to help you blend into the environment. Once acquired, they can be ordered to flirt with guards to distract them, allowing the protagonist to slip by undetected. Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches. Hitman Absolution features a mission in which the player can create a diversion by picking up and dumping the dead body of an exotic dancer near police officers. Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches. The first 3 games in the Saints Row series feature a recurring activity called Snatch. These missions require the player to steal prostituted women, referred to as hoes in the game, from pimps and then deliver them to a brothel or another pimp in return for a cut of their business. Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches. In these scenarios, instrumentality is heavily linked to the commodification of women. Since objects can be bought and sold, it follows that once women have been turned into objects, their bodies and sexuality can also be bought and sold. Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches. The 1996 game Duke Nukem 3D allowed players to interact with female NPCs by paying them to flash their boobs. That was almost 20 years ago. Today, games where the player can buy a lap dance or prostituted women are commonplace.
In mature titles, and now we are probably excluding most of the racing games which don't have as much in the way of lap dances and prostitutes.
The practice of using hypersexualized women as ornamental objects has been especially brazen in the racing game genre.
So even though you say lap dances and prostitutes are commonplace, when you account for all the factors, they aren't as common as you lead people to believe.
Studied extensively in both Sleeping Dogs and the Grand Theft Auto franchise, buying and using prostituted women for sex rewards the player with power-ups, stat boosts, and/or health regeneration, which means that these women fulfill basically the same function as the beverages the player can purchase from vending machines and convenience stores in these games. This is a textbook example of another component of objectification referred to as fungibility or interchangeability. Nussbaum explains this as occurring when the objectifier treats the object as interchangeable with other objects of the same type, and/or with objects of other types.
The Legend of Zelda. Hearts. Items that restore Link's heart containers. Hearts can be found after a monster is slain, which means that these monsters serve a similar function to red potions that can be purchased from shops. NPCs that are interchangeable with other objects is not specific to prostitutes in mature titles.
Since these women serve an identical or nearly identical resource function within the game space,
get in, baby.
They're created to be interchangeable with any other female NPC of the same type. A fact reinforced when developers simply copy and paste the same character models into various locations throughout the environment.
NPCs of all types are copy and pasted throughout games. It's not rare to have an enemy with a recoloring of the same skin later in the same game. Developers do this in part to save time on resources, and also because a great deal of NPCs aren't that important. You don't have to give every NPC in a game an identity or personality.
Non-playable sex objects have little to no individual personality or identity to speak of.
It's like you're trying to make us feel sorry for these characters.
A line can be drawn from the crude, sensationalized misogyny of Duke Nukem directly to the most recent installment of the blockbuster game series Grand Theft Auto.
So once they introduced these elements into games, they've been around ever since, just like almost any other form of media. Why should games be a form of media that does not have these themes, since you never prove the negative side effects?
In which players are rewarded for touching women after purchasing a private dance. This touching mechanic is essentially a minigame, which involves the player groping a stripper to fill their like meter, without being caught by the bouncer. If that wasn't bad enough, the player is then rewarded with sex, as the dancer will go home with your character for successfully fondling them.
If it's a minigame, I assume it's optional. You have a choice to engage in it if that's the case, just as you can choose to watch a mature movie. It is optional, not mandatory.
These games systematize sexuality in ways that dehumanize women, essentially turning them into vending machines dispensing sex, along with other goods and services. Their worth as characters is measured entirely in terms of what they can give to the player.
As is the worth of any NPC in a game. If a pedestrian walking down the street can offer you nothing, then it is worthless outside of the realism you get from seeing people walk down a street.
Since these women are just objects, there's no need or reason for players to have any emotional engagement with them. Meaningful relationships or interactions are not even possible. Their programming simply does not allow for it.
I want to explain to my audience what Anita is trying to get at with these NPCs. She wants them to have personalities and identities.
Non-playable sex objects have little to no individual personality or identity to speak of.
The reason you don't see many meaningful relationships with NPCs is because they serve a specific function.
All with varying degrees of importance or levels of engagement with the protagonist.
And they are scripted to function a specific way.
And whose behaviors and dialogue are governed by automated scripts within the game's code.
It takes a hell of a lot of time and resources to design NPCs in games the way you think they should be portrayed. Very few game developers can take this many NPCs and give them all fleshed out personalities or identities. It's just not realistic to expect that of game developers.
When men are depicted using female NPCs as tools or commodities, their actions are portrayed as part of what makes them powerful, which is by extension part of what makes the player then feel powerful.
Even if it makes a player feel powerful, there are no proven negative effects from these games.
So these interactive algorithms transmit cultural messages of near constant affirmation of male heterosexual dominance, while simultaneously reinforcing the widespread regressive belief that women's primary role is to satisfy the desires of men, either literally or voyeuristically.
These are a subset of NPCs in some games. There are several female representations in games and several female characters that do not reinforce regressive notions about women.
This is especially sad because interactive media has the potential to be a perfect medium to genuinely explore sex and sexuality,
even though it only has potential. One thing I've learned about Jonathan McIntosh since I started reviewing these videos is he is always talking about how video games could be a perfect medium for exploring aspects of humanity, but it is always implied, not factual in nature. Also, the part where Anita said especially sad.
This is especially sad.
Anita spent a great deal of this video laying a guilt trip on people who play these games, framing developers in a certain light, and criticizing them for the way these women are portrayed. Then she tells us what these games could potentially be used for.
Interactive media has the potential to be a perfect medium to genuinely explore sex and sexuality.
Anita and McIntosh want developers to go a certain direction, and they do this with lies, manipulation, guilt trips, unfair criticism, and then give us a possibility. A potential for what games can do that is not proven. They want game developers to invest their time and their money on something Anita or McIntosh cannot prove will happen the way they want it to happen.
Studied extensively.
A lot of McIntosh's ideology is a faith-based system, not a fact-based system. He believes if he gets his way, things will just happen the way he wants it to.
But that's not what's happening here. These interactions set up a transactional relationship in which women are reduced to a base sexual function. It frames female sexuality as something that belongs to others, rather than as something women enjoy for themselves.
Except for games like Bayonetta, where their character is sexy for herself. But when that happens, you say this.
But I'm not really here to discuss the overly sexualized adolescent male fantasy that Bayonetta is, because it's basically a choose-your-own patriarchal adventure porno fantasy.
With Anita, you just can't win. It does not matter what a game developer does. If it does not conform specifically to her ideology, it will always be problematic. Women being portrayed as sexy, even if it is designed by a woman, as was the case for Bayonetta, it's still a problem.
I'd argue that none of this is really about sex at all. Certainly nothing resembling authentic consensual intimacy.
I'd argue that you already said what some of these things are for. You know, power-ups, stat boosts, and health.
Buying and using prostituted women for sex rewards the player with power-ups, stat boosts, and/or health regeneration.
And in the real world, people don't generally sleep with prostitutes because they are looking for intimacy or meaningful relationships. They just want to have sex.
Publishers and developers are instead selling a particular fantasy about male power centered on the control of women. Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches. Of course, we can't really talk about sexual objectification without also addressing the issue of violence against women, since the two are intimately connected.
Real-world violence against women is not connected with video games.
Once a person is reduced to the status of objecthood, violence against that object becomes intrinsically permitted. In many open-world or sandbox-style games, developers construct their virtual worlds in such a way as to enable players to directly abuse non-playable sex objects.
Are we just talking about open-world and sandbox games?
In many open-world or sandbox-style games, from a systemic, big-picture perspective, game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches.
Also, various NPCs can be abused in open world and sandbox games. I don't think it's just sex objects.
This ability to violate the bodily integrity of eroticized women for fun highlights two other insidious aspects of objectification, those being violability and disposability. Violability occurs when, as Newspawn points out, The objectifier treats the object as lacking in boundary integrity, as something that it is permissible to break up, smash, break into.
That argument could be applied to many other NPCs than what you are talking about.
Players are often permitted to knock out, pick up, carry, and throw around inert female bodies. And depending on the game series, the programmed options for interaction can include assault, mutilation, murder, and everything in between.
Which could be applied to various other NPCs. This is one of the biggest criticisms of Anita's videos, is she takes games where you can do this to a variety of NPCs, yet she only shows when it is done to female NPCs, the ones she handpicked for these videos.
Some games explicitly incentivize and reward this kind of behavior by having murdered women drop bundles of cash for the player to collect and add to their own stash.
Zelda, rupees, obtained primarily by defeating enemies.
The dehumanization caused by objectification inevitably leads us to the concept of disposability, which is defined as something designed for or capable of being thrown away after being used or used up.
Dehumanization? These are NPCs, Anita. They aren't that important. Not all violence needs to be framed as tragic.
The protagonist in the critically acclaimed Red Dead Redemption doesn't agree to buying sex. Instead, the game allows players to lasso, hogtie, and carry away prostituted women, who continue to suggestively proposition the player even while being held captive.
Did you say critically acclaimed?
The protagonist in the critically acclaimed Red Dead Redemption.
What I've noticed, Anita, is people didn't seem to care about this stuff as much as they did before you showed up. There were people talking about it, but it was never taken to the extreme that people take it right now. And these things happen in games where all sorts of NPCs can be treated like crap.
The game also rewards players with a special achievement trophy called Dastardly, which is unlocked by placing a hogtied woman on the railroad tracks and then watching as she is splattered by an oncoming train.
I'm being honest here. Just like with Fat Princess and Spelunky in your Damsel in Distress videos, I started laughing when I saw this for the first time. I still stand by what I said before. Some of this stuff is not meant to be taken seriously.
When assaulted by the player, non-playable sex objects might scream,
I need help!
cower,
Oh no!
run away, or occasionally offer some form of perfunctory resistance.
I've lost count of the amount of NPCs who run around screaming in sandbox games, both men and women. These scripted responses from some characters is nothing specific to sexy women in games.
But regardless of the canned automated reaction, they are all designed to be expendable, to be used up and then tossed out.
They are expendable because they are not important.
Their status as disposable objects is reinforced by the fact that in most games, discarded bodies will simply vanish into thin air a short time after being killed.
Vanishing into thin air is because they are not important. And in some games, if the bodies never disappear, it keeps eating up resources as they pile up. There are reasons game developers do this that you are not explaining.
I should note that this kind of misogynistic behavior isn't always mandatory. Often it's player-directed, but it is always implicitly encouraged.
You say misogynist behavior, all because someone wanted to beat up some random NPCs in a game for the hell of it.
In order to understand how this works, let's take a moment to examine how video game systems operate as playgrounds for player engagement. Games ask us to play with them. Now, that may seem obvious, but bear with me. Game developers set up a series of rules, and then within those rules, we're invited to test the mechanics to see what we can do and what we can't do. We are encouraged to experiment with how the system will react or respond to our inputs, and discover which of our actions are permitted and which are not. The play comes from figuring out the boundaries and possibilities within the game space.
You gave a great explanation of why game developers design games like this. They want you to test your limits, see what is permitted, and where the boundaries are. If they didn't do this, it would defeat the purpose of testing your limits, especially with sandbox-style games where they keep adding things and pushing the limits of what a player can do within the boundaries of the game. If developers start to limit what is acceptable by your ideology, you start to limit the possibilities of where a game can take a curious mind.
So in many of the titles we've been discussing, the game makers have set up a series of possible scenarios involving vulnerable, eroticized female characters.
These scenarios also exist with other types of NPCs.
Players are then invited to explore and exploit those situations during their playthrough.
Same with other NPCs.
The player cannot help but treat these female bodies as things to be acted upon, because they were designed, constructed, and placed in the environment for that singular purpose.
Yes, they can help it. It is a choice they make. No one is forcing them to do that. These characters are not there for a singular purpose. You said these were possible scenarios.
So in many of the titles we've been discussing, the game makers have set up a series of possible scenarios involving vulnerable, eroticized female characters.
Meaning even if a player does that to the female character, it is a choice to decide what they do with the body. You also said players can choose to spy on them.
These active viewing mechanics encourage players to collaborate with developers in sexual objectification by enabling gamers to scope out and spy on non-playable sex objects.
They can choose to kick their ass or spy on them, or if I'm not mistaken, skip the section. As I recall in one of Thunderfoot's videos, he said going through this area was optional.
So I watched a playthrough of the missions, of which there were plenty. I watched about 40 or so of these people playing the mission. Turns out there are two ways of doing it, and only one of those takes you past the girls doing their makeup, and one doesn't. So about 3/4 went the easier route, and about 1/4 went past the dancers.
It isn't as bad as you make it sound when you account for all the factors.
Players are meant to derive a perverse pleasure from desecrating the bodies of unsuspecting virtual female characters. It's a rush streaming from a carefully concocted mix of sexual arousal connected to the act of controlling and punishing representations of female sexuality. Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches while consciously trying to figure out how to best misrepresent women as part of some grand conspiracy.
It doesn't sound as bad when I use your own arguments against you.
Studied extensively. In-game consequences for these violations are trivial at best, and rarely lead to any sort of fail state or game over.
Serious consequences for some of this stuff would make these games boring. People want to play games, not be overly punished for playing them the way they want to play them.
Sometimes areas may go on high alert for a few minutes, during which players have to lay low or hide before the game and its characters forget that you just murdered a sexualized woman in cold blood. These temporary game states are implemented so that acts of violence against NPCs committed by players do not inconvenience or interfere too much with the core gaming experience.
One moment you specify sexualized women, then you specify NPCs.
You just murdered a sexualized woman in cold blood. These temporary game states are implemented so that acts of violence against NPCs.
You like to keep pointing out the fact these are overly sexualized women, but then point out some of these games have similar ramifications for doing the same thing to various other NPCs. You are making game developers sound more nefarious than they really are by the words you choose and how you frame your arguments.
High alert serves as a faux punishment that doesn't ruin the fun, and is in fact actually designed and intended to provide an added rush to the game experience, as players try to avoid or mow down law enforcement AI.
Mowing down law enforcement, just like mowing down sexualized women in games.
Players are then invited to explore and exploit those situations during their playthrough, and is in fact actually designed and intended to provide an added rush to the game experience, as players try to avoid or mow down law enforcement AI.
You also said high alert doesn't ruin the fun, just as how you aren't overly penalized for harming sexualized characters.
In-game consequences for these violations are trivial at best, and rarely lead to any sort of fail state or game over. High alert serves as a faux punishment that doesn't ruin the fun, and is in fact actually designed and intended to provide an added rush to the game experience.
The point I'm making is if you were overly punished for this stuff, these games might not be as fun.
Returning to the Grand Theft Auto franchise, you can buy a prostituted woman, use her for sex, gain the health and stat boost, then murder her to get your money back.
I think I remember swindling shopkeepers out of stuff in Skyrim. Screwing over NPCs in games is nothing new. It's just that in Grand Theft Auto, you can screw them, then screw them over.
If caught by the police, the screen will fade to black, and 5 seconds later, your character will be standing outside the police station, minus a few dollars or items, but free to go about your business as if nothing happened. Other popular sandbox games employ similar character revival methods.
There is no immersion if you're always met with a game over screen for messing around in a sandbox-style game. Game over for too much of this stuff ruins the fun.
In this way, these systems work to facilitate male violence against women by turning it into a form of play.
It's not just women you can commit violence against. These are not nefarious game developers.
Something constructed to be amusing and entertaining.
Exactly. These games are meant to be amusing and entertaining. Until you can demonstrate these games are harmful, I don't see why people should stop having fun with things they've been enjoying for years.
Now, inevitably, whenever these game mechanics are criticized, some gamers try to dismiss and distance themselves from the issue by insisting that they don't personally partake in the provided options for exploiting virtual women. But whether or not an individual player chooses to use an object for its intended purpose is irrelevant, because that object was still designed and placed in the game environment to fulfill its function.
Now, inevitably, whenever a pop culture critic has their work rebutted by legitimate arguments, sometimes they try to dismiss and distance themselves from this issue by focusing on their harassment instead of addressing the issues with their work. But whether a critic decides to talk about their harassment is irrelevant, because the arguments leveled against them are still valid regardless.
A toaster is still a toaster, regardless of whether or not you choose to make toast with it. It's still designed for the express purpose of toasting bread, and it still communicates that fact even while sitting unused on your kitchen counter.
A toaster invites you to explore the mechanic of making toast. It was designed and constructed for the singular purpose of making toast. You are meant to derive a gluttonous pleasure from eating toast. The desire to make toast is a carefully concocted mix of hunger connected to the desire to toast bread and eat toast.
Likewise, a sex object is still a sex object, regardless of whether or not you personally choose to use and abuse her. And that fact, in and of itself, still communicates extremely regressive ideas about women.
So you can choose not to act upon the sex object.
The player cannot help but treat these female bodies as things to be acted upon, regardless of whether or not you personally choose to use and abuse her.
The point I'm making is some of this stuff is a choice. It's not necessarily some carefully concocted mix of anything. I know you may not be fond of what I'm about to say, but it needs to be said. It's just a game.
Indeed, nothing about the design, behaviors, or mechanics associated with female characters that serve as background decoration encourages or engenders any sort of human empathy. In fact, quite the opposite. The rudimentary algorithms governing interactions lead the player to interface with these characters in ways that can only be dehumanizing and exploitative. As sexual automata, they don't have any individuality. They don't have their own stories. Players are never supposed to identify with them or care about them outside of what they can offer either sexually or materially. They exist on the outskirts of humanity, placed beyond the reach of empathy by their creators.
See what I've been saying? She wants us to empathize with them. She wants us to feel sorry for them. She wants them to have personalities and identities. Anita wants things out of these games that have nothing to do with women being background decoration. Several of these arguments could be applied to any NPC in a sandbox-style game, especially ones you can commit violence against.
Typically, all the non-essential characters in sandbox-style games are killable, but it's the sexualized women whose instrumentality and brutalization is gendered and eroticized in ways that men never are, because it's a reflection of our society. The visual language attached to male NPCs is very different, since they're rarely designed to be sexually inviting or arousing, and they're not coded to interact with the player in ways meant to reaffirm a heterosexual fantasy about being a stud.
Outside of sexualized female NPCs, I could say the same thing about other women in games. A girl walking down the street dressed for an office job doesn't exactly reinforce a heterosexual fantasy about being a stud.
There do exist a handful of games which include a few male gigolos, though they are extremely rare. And more often than not, the design and characterization of these sexualized men is played for laughs. But even if sexualized male NPCs were more prevalent, equal opportunity sexual objectification is still not the solution to this problem.
Not the solution. Earlier, Anita mentioned how sexualized female NPCs are aimed at a straight male player.
But the presence of a woman inhabiting the role of protagonist, even if well developed, doesn't do anything to negate the fact that non-playable sex objects are still specifically coded to pander to a presumed heterosexual male ego. But even if sexualized male NPCs were more prevalent, equal opportunity sexual objectification is still not the solution to this problem.
Even if they gave Anita the male strippers for a female protagonist, she still defines it as an issue, because reversing the role is not the solution.
Studied extensively.
Much like what I felt about the damsel in distress, these videos are more like an instruction manual on how to get rid of the trope in its traditional sense, providing you follow everything that is outlined in the videos.
Especially considering the existing power differential between men and women in our society. Women are constantly represented as primarily for sex,
You already defined this trope as a subset of NPCs, and it is primarily found in racing games and mature titles. Women are not constantly represented as primarily for sex in video games, and this is supposed to be a critique of video games, not other forms of media or the real world.
Men may be sexual too, but they can also be anything else. They are not defined by or reduced to their sexuality, and their sexuality is not thought of as something existing chiefly for the pleasure of others. Which means the fundamentally dominant position of men in our culture is not in any way challenged or diminished by the rare male depiction as sex worker.
Women may be sexualized more often than men, but they can also be anything else in games just as men can. In a well-balanced fighting games, the female characters can fight on par with the men. You said so yourself in Damsel in Distress Part 2.
Female characters who happen to be involved in violent or combat situations on relatively equal footing with their opponents are typically exempt from this category because they're not usually framed as victims.
If a female can fight a guy in a fighting game like that, then they can be anything in a game, just like a man can be anything in a game.
All the forms of interactive engagement we're discussing in this episode, the act of looking, the instrumentality, the commodification, the violability, and the disposability, are embedded in the DNA of some of the most popular video game franchises. So whereas in traditional media, viewers might see representations of women being used or exploited, gaming offers players the unique opportunity to use and exploit female bodies themselves. This forces gamers to become complicit with developers in making sexual objectification a participatory activity. Game creators aren't necessarily all sitting around twirling their nefarious-looking mustaches, so why does any of this matter? What's the real harm in sexually objectifying women?
Here's the moment that started it all.
Well, the negative impacts of sexual objectification have been studied extensively over the years.
The negative effects of these video games and their associated tropes most certainly have not been studied extensively.
And the effects on people of all genders are quite clear and very serious. Research has consistently found that exposure to these types of images negatively impacts perceptions and beliefs about real-world women and reinforces harmful myths about sexual violence.
Research has consistently found there to be no long-term negative side effects associated with playing video games that have overly sexualized women.
We know that women tend to internalize these types of images and self-objectify.
I've noticed that people tend to internalize the messages in these videos and then believe the lies and manipulation.
When women begin to think of themselves as objects and treat themselves accordingly, it results in all kinds of social issues.
When people begin to think of these games as harmful and treat developers negatively, it causes all sorts of social media issues.
Everything from eating disorders to clinical depression, from body shame to habitual body monitoring.
Everything from claims of misogyny to claims of sexism, from shaming developers to habitual hate campaigns.
We also see distinct decreases in self-worth, life satisfaction, and cognitive functioning.
We've also seen people spreading lies and misinformation about games, like what's found in your videos. And it's all based on a bunch of lazy research.
Studied extensively, but the negative effects on men are just as alarming, albeit in slightly different ways. Studies have found, for example, that after having viewed sexually objectified female bodies, men in particular tend to view women as less intelligent, less competent, and disturbingly express less concern for their physical well-being or safety. Furthermore, this perception is not limited only to sexualized women. In what's called the spillover effect, these sexist attitudes carry over to perceptions of all women as a group, regardless of their attire, activities, or professions.
You presented no studies that prove there are long-term negative effects on men from video games.
Researchers have also found that after long-term exposure to hypersexualized images, people of all genders tend to be more tolerant of the sexual harassment of women, and more readily accept rape myths, including the belief that sexually assaulted women were asking for it, deserved it, or are the ones to blame for being victimized.
My observation has been that after long-term exposure to your harassment narrative, people tend to view criticism of your work as hate-driven in nature and more readily reject valid criticism of your videos.
In other words, viewing media that frames women as objects or sexual playthings profoundly impacts how real-life women are perceived and treated in the world around us. And that is all without even taking into account how video games allow for a more participatory form of objectification that we've been discussing in this episode.
The reason you can't account for the participatory aspect of video games is because none of your studies show video games to be any more harmful than any other piece of media when it comes to overly sexualized women.
Compounding the problem is the widespread belief that, despite all the evidence, exposure to media has no real-world impact. There's often a lot of hostility towards watching TV, like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's going to warp our brains, but I don't think that's true. While it may be comforting to think that we all have a personal force field protecting us from outside influences, this is simply not the case. Scholars sometimes refer to this type of denial as the third-person effect, which is the tendency for people to believe that they are personally immune to media's effects, even if others may be influenced or manipulated.
Your videos influence and manipulate people in ways I could never have imagined when I first started reviewing your work.
Paradoxically, and somewhat ironically, those who most strongly believe that media is just harmless entertainment are also the ones most likely to uncritically internalize harmful media messages.
Ironically, your videos that are meant to educate people on how big picture these issues are or the negative effects of these games do little to prove anything, because it's all based on a bunch of lazy research.
Studied extensively. In short, the more you think you cannot be affected, the more likely you are to be affected.
In short, the more I review these videos, the more I see how terrible your work is.
Please join me for our next video, in which we will continue our discussion of the women as background decoration trope by examining the growing trend of exploiting sexual violence as a plot device in game narratives.
I will be joining you in your next video when I get around to reviewing it. If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.